Welcome everyone to today's webcast. We'll be getting started in just about 2 minutes. We're just about 1 minute away from starting today's webcast, so sit tight. Welcome everyone to today's webcast, Counterforensics. I'm your host, Nick Cavalancia from Tech Evangelism. Now, before we get started today, let's cover just a couple of housekeeping items. Today's webcast is, of course, being recorded, and you'll be sent a link within the next few days. So some of you have already asked about that. Don't worry about it at all. We'll be sending that to you to your email. The Q&A box is, of course, your way of engaging with today's speaker, so be sure to ask questions throughout today's presentation, and we'll have a formal Q&A session at the end of the webcast. Now, with those issues out of the way, let's talk just really quickly about today's topic. The use of digital forensics has obviously been around for quite some time. But in recent years, attackers, that's both internal and external, have become wise and include the work of covering their tracks during an attack. According to Carbon Black's recent incident response threat report, 72% of attacks include the destroying of logs as just one example of how attackers might cover their tracks. And according to their global threat report of 2019, 60% of all attacks involve lateral movement, of course, the jumping from machine to machine, which requires internal credentials, which makes the bad guys eventually look like the good guys. So on top of all that, true insiders misusing their privileges are often savvy enough to also to find ways to obfuscate their actions and eliminate the audit trail. So it's a real problem that we really want to discuss today by providing you some good information about it. And here to discuss counterforensics tactics and methodologies is our speaker today, Patrick Knight. Now, Patrick is the Senior Director of Cyber Strategy and Product Management at Veriato. His cybersecurity career spans 17 years working for companies like McAfee, Intel, and Cylance. He's been helping enterprises protect against online threats through the development of anti-malware, network intrusion detection, computer and network forensics, and encryption technologies. He's also a writer and speaker on topics of cybersecurity and privacy in multiple forums. You've probably maybe seen him on Virus Bulletin, SC Magazine, and Forbes. He's also a 12-year veteran of the U.S. intelligence community in the United States Army in the fields of signals intelligence and cryptanalysis. And also, just if that's not enough, he's also a Russian and Serbo-Croatian linguist. So, Patrick, with that, Privyet, that's hello in Russian, and please take it away.
Veriato, Nick, thank you for that kind introduction, man. I'm excited about this topic. It's been something that's been on my mind for years, going back to the earliest days of my career. As you mentioned, when I was in the intelligence community, counterintelligence was foremost on our minds to make sure that when we're collecting information, were we certain that we weren't being fooled, that the target wasn't trying to masquerade what they're doing or somehow thwart our efforts. And when I started my commercial security, online security career, it started out with computer forensics and network forensics, and the same rules applied now in the digital area. So again, this has been something that's been on my mind for years, and now I'm really excited to talk about it in the context of insider threats and why organizations need to be aware of this, and then ultimately we hope to educate a little bit on what organizations can do to identify it and mitigate it. I just want to do a little housekeeping up front. I want to make sure that you can see my slides. Nick, just give me a thumbs up if you can see what is counterforensics.
I can. You're all good. Keep going.
Excellent. All right. So technical issues are behind us. So what is counterforensics? For the audience, if you're unfamiliar with this area, if you did any online searching, you might find a similar term, anti-forensics. As far as I'm concerned, the two are synonymous. I derive and prefer the term counterintelligence, or counterforensics rather, probably a personal bias based on my background, again, in the intelligence community. I took it from the term counterintelligence, which are activities designed to prevent or thwart spying, intelligence gathering, and sabotage by an enemy or another foreign entity. So if you take that concept and then put it into the digital world, then counterforensics would be a similar concept, activities designed to prevent or thwart forensics investigations through data destruction, activity concealment, deception, and sabotage as well. And there are a lot of ways that a user could use tools and actions to try to perform a malicious act, or just, let's say, just get away with being unproductive by using these techniques. And to an organization, whether you're large or small, you probably have concerns over, are my employees trying to subvert our attempts to protect our data, or are they simply just trying to get by for the afternoon without being productive? And there's a lot of context for where these techniques would be a concern, and no organization is exempt. So again, comparing to the counterintelligence definition and model in the counterforensics world, there's about 4 primary areas that we're going to touch on today. And this is a really feature-rich topic. So I'm going to be hitting some of these probably at a high level, because some of these in and of themselves are deep dives, and I'll hit on some of those areas as we approach them. But in general, there's 4 areas I like to break down counterforensics when it comes to computer forensics, computer activities, and network activities. And that would be activities that, where a user is trying to hide or conceal what they're doing. Actual acts of deception, where they're trying to make it look like something else happened. Sorry, my screen is flaking up. All right, can you still see my screen? Sorry about that. There was a glitch on my end. I just want to make sure it's not affecting the viewers.
You're good.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. So as I was mentioning, so deception. So these are actions that a user might be doing to make it look like something else entirely is going on. Sorry, once again, I'm getting flakiness on my end. I hope no one else is seeing it, but it's disrupting my view. So my apologies for the interruption. Thirdly, destroying evidence. So when you're trying to hide your actions online, can a user try to perform actions that are going to hide what they did and remove the evidence so that it can't be discovered later? And lastly, probably one of the more malicious actions that a user could do to thwart a forensics investigation would be to sabotage efforts in the organization to see what's going on. So we're going to hit on each of these individually and do a little bit more of a deep dive. Again, these are very topic-rich ideas. So I'm going to give a few examples of each and talk about some of them. I want to encourage folks that are interested in this topic to do their own deep dive and look even deeper. So when it comes to hiding or concealing your activities, there are a lot of actions that a user could use using tools or even techniques on their endpoint to hide or to conceal what they are doing. One of the first areas that often comes up when it comes to this topic is the use of steganography tools. Now, steganography is the act of hiding something within something else, often, sometimes even in plain sight. One of the most common ways that this is used is through the use of hiding messages or documents within image or video format files. So that there are tons of steganography tools that enable a user to do this. And this is a data egress concern for any organization. And unsurprisingly, there are tons and tons of tools that a user could use to hide data and then therefore leak stuff to a third party and evade the onlooking eyes of any organization that might be trying to monitor egress data from their organization. There's other ways to hide data using just common file formats or common channels to hide data in plain sight. So you might, for example, take a document that has a lot of text in it, all your secret customer lists or whatever, and say possibly rename it to a JPEG image or something that might look inconspicuous, and yet the data doesn't change, but to the casual looker it may appear as if something else. So there are a lot of ways that a user can just hide stuff in plain sight and get it through the gateway, if you will. File concatenation is another trick I've seen over the years in forensics investigations. What I mean by that is where you might want to append your secret document or the sensitive data onto the end of another file format, for example, attaching your Word document to the end of a JPEG image. And most image readers would probably see that image file and read the image portion of it because it comes first. And the rest of the data might look like garbage, and the application may do nothing. So if you were to, for example, possibly email that document out of the organization and then separate the two once you receive it on the other end, or once the intended party receives it, then now they've got the secret document right there in plain sight and just snuck out the door. Now, if you're a little bit more security conscious, perhaps rather than just sending the documents out in otherwise plain text, you might actually encrypt the data. And this is another problem for a lot of organizations. If their users are using unsanctioned encryption applications, that means they don't have the keys, they don't have the controls over it. And if data goes out, the encrypted data is going to be very difficult to recover in order to prove what happened in many forensics investigations. And not just encrypting files or data, but also encrypting your communications channels. Again, typically using encryption technologies that are not sanctioned by the organization. And there are a lot of examples of tools that can be used for that. For example, the command line tools, OpenSSL and Netcat. And I'm going to mention these briefly in a moment as I go just a little deeper into some of these areas. So we first talked about steganography. So why is steganography a tactic that users might want to use? Now, I don't want to misrepresent and say that image files or video files are the only documents formats that a secret message or secret data could be inserted into. They're just some of the most common. Most of the steganography tools you're going to see are going to enable the user to insert data into either image or video files. Why? Because number one, the casual viewer will never know that there's data in that. It's just going to look like it's an image file, and they're so prevalent, these formats, and they can transport the data whether it's encrypted or in plain text. And the intended recipient of such a embedded secret message or embedded sensitive data could be difficult to identify. For example, if a user was to take image files or video files, insert the sensitive company information into it, and post it on a public chat or bulletin board system, the intended recipient might see that and download it, but so are hundreds or thousands of other users. This was actually a real world scenario that back in my intelligence days we had to be concerned with. You know, what if terrorists were posting their secret messages to bulletin boards? And at the time, let's just say adult sites were commonly used because they had plenty of purveyors of that data. Most of them would be unaware that there was an embedded message or embedded data in their image file. But one of them probably did know and got the message loud and clear. So identifying the intended target was always going to be a very difficult challenge given the noise and the typical purveyors of that kind of data. Now with the dark web, it's probably even infinitely more difficult because of the anonymity associated with that. But nonetheless, embedding messages and posting them on public forums can also help conceal who the intended target was as well, especially if you're leaking data. A lot of reasons here to be concerned. And lastly, but not least, most endpoint security products typically do not scan these formats. They're not looking for embedded messages. They might be looking for vulnerabilities where an exploit is being used, but that's it. And this is a little bit different than an exploit. So it's typically a method that can evade most watching eyes, at least from traditional endpoint security technologies. So again, steganography is probably one of the most popular deceptive techniques used by insiders if they want to leak data or get it out while evading the watchful eyes of their organization. When we talked about concealing messages in the open, and you can use it you can do this not just in documents but also in communications technologies. Firewalls are built to allow certain data through while blocking others, and this is just a very, very basic concept to drive home the point of how trivial this is. This is just a regular ping message. Most of us have heard of ping if you're not a network security or network engineer, but we've heard of ping, ICMP protocol message. Well, you can actually put a message in a ping packet and send it. And the default size for IP version 4 for a ping packet is 65,000 bytes, which gives you a lot of space for a message. And this is just to identify or to illustrate how trivial this is to send data out over a common network format that most firewalls are going to allow. Now, a lot of organizations are probably blocking ping more and more these days, and this may be one of the reasons. But there are other protocols where this is just as trivial that typically will be allowed through the firewall. And again, this is not a document. It is not a secret format. It is built into the protocol itself and just enables the user to send messages over something that is otherwise trivial. And so if you think about that, then think about all the other ways that data in and out of your network that you may think is being blocked, or at least you may think you have adequate firewall rules in place, but the data you're allowing through still could have features in the protocols themselves that enable some sort of messaging or data egress. And so again, this is just to illustrate how trivial this can be with just a common ping packet. Here's another one that caught our attention recently, and this again falls under the deception umbrella and hiding things in plain sight. If, let's say, an employee is just wanting to binge watch their Game of Thrones or their Stranger Things episodes and do it while at work. Well, recently there was an article, and we even blogged about it ourselves, about this Google Chrome extension called Netflix Hangouts. It is a extension that is designed to impersonate a office communications and conferencing technology. So while they're secretly watching or catching up on their videos, possibly with their headsets in, to the casual passerby, they're going to look like they're on a conference call, and while the entire time they're actually on Netflix. And so this is sort of a deceptive tactic that leads directly into productivity, where the employee might be looking like they're productive, looking like they're at work, and too busy, they're on a call. So maybe the boss walks by their cubicle or their office and says, "Oh, you know, Patrick's on it looks like he's on a conference call. Well, I'll bother him later," and walks on by. And so, in this particular Netflix Hangout extension for Chrome actually promotes itself as watch Netflix at work. So they're practically inviting wasteful time and wasted effort at work. So this is an interesting thought that when I first heard of this, I said that falls definitely into the deceptive category of counterforensics. One of the other areas we talked about was concealing activities and data, and primarily through encryption. And this is going to be one of the harder top areas for some investigations when you don't have the keys to decrypt the data. And encryption these days is ubiquitous, so it should be unsurprising that there are tons of tools, applications, whether for encrypting documents or just encrypting your channels out of the organization. And this is more and more ubiquitous these days, and makes forensics investigations after the fact, after a breach or after an incident has occurred, just infinitely more difficult. And typically this type of a breach would occur through the use of non-sanctioned encryption tools, because most organizations are probably going to have some encryption needs. They might have full disk encryption so that if a laptop is ever lost or stolen, that only the organization can recover it, and that the whoever has the device in their hands, if they're unauthorized, hopefully wouldn't be able to access it. But beyond that, there are tons of other tools, free and otherwise, that enable file encryption, disk encryption, communications encryption, and if they're not sanctioned by the organization, then they could possibly be used for a breach or some other form of data egress. These tools are often used to obscure their communications in a way that they know would bypass at least the ability for organizations to see what's being read. They might be able to see that there's some data going out, but be unable to read it. And one of the more common tools to facilitate this these days is the Tor browser, or just the Tor proxy, which enables the encryption that the Tor browser can facilitate. If you're unfamiliar with the Tor browser, this partially has to do with the dark web, meaning it is a dark web enabled browser that enables an individual to go to parts of the internet that Google and Yahoo don't see. And in that area, we did a webinar on this topic earlier this year. If you want more details about this, but as a summary, a lot of illicit activities go on the dark web, purchasing weapons, hiring hackers, drug-related purchases, illicit materials of other types like adult content, for example. But also it's a gateway straight through encrypted channels to another part of the internet, so that you can come back out on the other end, and it masquerades your identity, masquerades your IP address, and it's encrypted internally, so that if your organization didn't sanction the use of this, and most wouldn't, then they wouldn't be able to read the traffic either. And so it makes this type of anything that can be transferred through the browser really challenging for organizations to be able to monitor if they don't block the application or the egress data altogether. I mentioned earlier there's also command line tools that a user could use to encrypt data and send it out to another recipient. OpenSSL, EncryptCat are a couple of very common tools, but if you just Google this topic, you'll see that there are tons and tons of tools that facilitate this. And again, a very easy way for a user to send data out of the organization, bypassing sanction tools and bypassing the ability of many organizations to observe what's going on once the data is encrypted. And we're going to talk a little bit later about what you can do to thwart that, given the challenge with encryption these days. Another area of counterforensics is destroying evidence. So let's say a user has committed an action. Now they know they've left logs, they know they've left footprints on the computer or on the network. There are several things that a user might do to then delete that data or destroy it, so that when a forensics investigation ever occurred, then the data would be gone. And think of this as a typical traditional physical crime scene type of investigation. An individual approaches someone else, let's say commits a very violent act, possibly a murder, decides to dump the body or burn the body, sweep over or rake over their footprints, and leave. So they've destroyed evidence. What kind of what would the forensics investigator do to try to figure out the timeline for what happened, put the correct individuals at the crime scene, figure out what was done? How hard would that be if the evidence were destroyed? Well, this is going to be a huge concern for any forensics investigation if the evidence itself is destroyed. And there are a lot of ways that users can destroy evidence. It may not be all of it. Sometimes it may be just enough to confuse or to otherwise obscure the investigation. They might do this through deleting files, deleting specific records. Let's say they have access to a database and they want to, the database had information on what they were doing and they decided to delete it, or one of the most common ways of destroying data on computers is to overwrite or wipe the files. If you're not familiar with this type of a tactic, wiping is a synonym for just overwriting a deleted file. That makes it so that once the file is deleted, the data that was on the hard drive can't be recovered. And that type of destruction really can mess up a forensics investigation. You can wipe files or selected records. There are tools that enable you to, if you have access to, for example, an email server, that email server, if you still host them yourselves these days, you can actually selectively wipe records off of the server. Most of that these days is cloud hosted, but many email servers still exist, and there are tools that facilitate that type of selective wiping, if you will. Or what if the user just decides to wipe their entire hard drive? Just everything's at risk, I'm going to wipe the whole thing. Either way, destroying data of this type makes it very difficult to recover. If you know much about physical hard drive forensics, once data has been overwritten, typically it takes something like an electron microscope to then try to recover what might have been overwritten. Look at it, think of it as tire tracks in the snow. When data is written to traditional hard drives, a track is left. If you overwrite that by taking several more passes of your truck through the snow, then you're not going to know which path was your data, and that's what happens with traditional SATA and IDE hard drives. Now these days with solid state drives, it's even harder because solid state likes to take care of this for you by overwriting data that is once it's written. So that actually makes data recovery on solid state drives a little bit more difficult, and that's even more challenging when it comes to a forensics investigation. Another aspect or topic when it comes to what a user could do to thwart a forensics investigation has to do with using various deceptive tactics. What can I as a user do to make it look like I'm doing something else, or to obscure my activities so that I'm either not drawing attention or I can otherwise evade an investigation? And again, a very topic-rich area here. I'm just going to go item by item as I list these here. So I mentioned earlier a physical crime scene investigation is typically, you're always going to hear the police officers or the detectives talk about building a timeline. Why? Because the order of which activities occur is critical. Digital data is logged. There's hardly a logging technology out there that doesn't have timestamps associated with it. If you're doing network forensics, you're going to get the timestamps for every packet that goes over the wire, and you can sort activities by the timeline and the forensics timestamp data that you can recover. Well, what happens if you alter the timestamps? And this can be done trivially with a lot of technologies. If you alter the timestamps, you can rearrange the order of events and therefore throw off the investigation. This can be done randomly or surgically, if you will, to either just totally wipe out a forensics investigation in this area, or deliberately, surgically make it look like something happened in a totally different order and therefore possibly draw a different conclusion from the investigation. There is a common tool that I'll mention in a moment that often comes up when it comes to altering timestamps. It's called time stomp. Again, you can use that to either just sort of massively alter timestamps in certain log formats or certain file system formats, or you can surgically do so, again, making it look like the activities occurred in a different order. Another tactic that might be done is to alter logs or other data. If they know that certain activities can be logged, what if I want to make it look like this never happened? Or what if I want to say, yes, I was logged into this particular server. If they have access to it and can alter the logs, they can actually plant data to make it look like they were doing something when they probably were otherwise goofing off or being unproductive. I actually had this happen at an employment many years ago, where an employee had more access than we probably should have back in the day, and he actually altered logs on one of our servers, made it look like he was doing work on it when he actually wasn't. He did it after the fact, but he planted information, and so that was made intended to make it look like he was, in this case, being productive when he actually wasn't. And I've actually seen the inverse as well, where data was destroyed from logs, again, probably due to excessive access by certain individuals. Probably shouldn't have had access to that data at all, and then ended up deleting data after they had finished their activities on the server. Obfuscation of information is, again, just a very rich, feature-rich area to investigate. There are papers written just on how a user can obfuscate data. Nick mentioned earlier my background with anti-malware. I had been in computer forensics and network forensics for some years before I entered into the anti-malware industry, and I was really interested to see some of these deceptive tactics and other counter-forensics measures that were being employed by malware. And obfuscation was probably one of the first and most obvious ones to me. Just the way that malware would be programmed to obscure or obfuscate information so that signatures would fail if they were looking for signature-based detections of certain activities. For example, network forensics, back in the day at least, there were a lot of vulnerabilities for certain web servers. File path, you can mess around with the file paths from misconfigured servers, and the malware that tried to access these vulnerable servers had file path traversal sort of obfuscation in it to, if you didn't normalize the path from your network forensics tool, then it would evade your the investigation tool ability to detect that there was an attempt to access data that it shouldn't have. My simple example here, just to show how trivial it is just using the Windows command tool, which is on every version of Windows, and how you can obfuscate a particular command. In this case, the command tool allows the caret symbol there as a wildcard, if you will. And so you can mask the fact that it's trying to call this tool. We'll call it a malicious tool, the calculator tool here, calc.exe. But if you can masquerade calling calc.exe, what else could you masquerade just from using this typical default tool on Windows? PowerShell is probably the primary shell tool used on most enterprises these days. Again, there are a lot of obfuscation capabilities there that if you're logging PowerShell activity against signatures, those signatures might fail if the activities are obfuscated in a way like this. Another deceptive tactic that would be high on anyone's radar would have to do with stolen credential use. And why is this deceptive? Because obviously you look like you're someone else when you're stealing the data or logging in after hours or sabotaging something. This is something that any organization should be concerned with, and is certainly deceptive because it gives the actual perpetrator typically plausible deniability, meaning that they can always say, no, it wasn't me, it was Jack over there, since it was Jack's credentials that was logged in. Stolen credential use is just such a huge topic right now because massive data breaches, massive hacks, and the resulting stolen credential data being sold on the dark web for use by criminals, for use by malware to now try to brute force access into public databases. Stolen credential use is just such a huge area to talk about when it comes to a deceptive tactic, and again, something that organizations are going to want to be mindful of and be looking at when it comes to counterforensics techniques. We talked about destroying data earlier, so there are several ways to do this. We talked about deleting data. Now, if you just delete a file, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, what happens for most hard drives and most operating systems is you're not losing the content that was on the hard drive. The file system is merely freeing up the location where that data was stored to be used again for new files or new data. If new data doesn't override it, then that data for most hard drive technologies stays there and can be recovered. So deleting data, while it can happen, doesn't necessarily thwart a full forensics investigation. Again, with solid state drives these days, it's more and more difficult to recover data that's been deleted and freed up. But it's still a possibility, but many users may not be aware that they have file wiping or data wiping tools available to them. They may simply try to just delete their files or records and think that's enough. So whether it's just deleting the data or wiping it, the user might choose one or the other, but either way, it's going to be a destruction of evidence and something that data recovery of some form is going to be needed. Another way of deleting data, very common, many of us have heard this for years, is deleting your browser history. Now, the interesting thing is most common browsers these days are making this possible for you by virtue of an incognito mode or a similar mode for each browser. They have different names for it, but it's ultimately the same concept, which is once you've completed your session, it will delete all your history, all your search and everything, so that the data at rest on the hard drive isn't available for a forensics investigation. So this is interesting now that browsers are building this in, which used to be sort of almost a joke when anyone is accessing stuff they know they shouldn't. Well, delete your browser history. That way the folks that come behind you and investigate won't see it. Well, the browsers are building this in now. So it's just something to be mindful of in your organizations when it comes to which browsers you are allowing and what the capabilities are of those browsers in your organization. And we already covered disk and data wiping. I don't think I need to repeat it, but again, the destruction of evidence here is pretty massive as far as the ability to recover it in a forensics investigation if it's actually been wiped. That's not, again, not to say that it can't be done, but the cost then goes way up if you need to try to recover data that's been actually wiped or overwritten. So a little bit more on what it means to delete a file. Again, differentiating here between deleting and wiping. So just the act of deleting a file for most operating systems is just freeing the data. It's not overwriting it. The same thing happens typically for email servers and any other technologies that have data that it deletes. It's not overwriting, it's just freeing the space or the files or the locations to be used again. But it's not actually destroying it. But secure deletion, wiping, can destroy it more permanently, or at least really increase your costs when it comes to how to recover that data if it's been overwritten. Overwriting typically is a multiple override. You can simply overwrite once, but if the user really wanted to have a higher degree of assurance that the data that they're overwriting can't be recovered, they're going to overwrite it multiple times. And most of these tools for wiping offer multiple overwrites. So some go to extreme. You can overwrite hundreds of times. From my experience, 3 to 7 typically is sufficient, but I haven't had my hands on an electron microscope recently to know how sophisticated data recovery can be beyond that. If I was going to thoroughly try to delete and overwrite data, I might also defragment my hard drive or the data that I am trying to destroy. Operating databases, for example, can be defragmented, if not the entire operating system. So what happens is when you defragment, you take the areas where data had been previously just deleted, and then you basically squeeze everything together, put it in order, makes it a little bit more efficient, presumably, and then that's part of the overriding aspect right there. And then you wipe whatever's left in your free space or your slack space. And if you're familiar with this kind of investigation, slack space is what's left at the end of a file in the actual blocks where the data is stored on the hard drive, and that's in that space beyond the end of the actual file, but before the end of the sector where the data is stored. That extra space there is often called slack space, and data can actually reside there, sometimes be hidden there on purpose. So a wiping process is going to involve that as well. But if you're using webmail or software as a service products, that's typically out of the control of a user to be able to actually do these type of actions. but the service providers themselves might be able to. So there's something to be mindful of as well. If you have a forensics investigation and having to query data from a webmail or otherwise a SaaS provider, they would have to then presumably do this type of data recovery if a forensics investigation was required. We mentioned data wiping tools. There are tons of these, and so I'm not going to go into all of them because I don't have a preference. They're just ubiquitous and they've been around for years. One thing I do want to point out here about 5 down is the format executable, which is part of Windows. You can actually do data wiping using the format application now, and it's built into the operating system. So think about that. You can use it to just overwrite data with nulls. And so if you're overwriting data, that data gets destroyed typically. But yeah, there are just tons and tons of data wiping tools out there. I believe the last area when it comes to what a user tactic a user might do to thwart or obscure a forensic investigation is just sabotage information. And this is probably one of the more scarier areas of what a rogue or a malicious user might be able to do. There were some headlines recently, earlier this year, I believe, about some high-profile technology companies where an employee had sabotaged data before they left. In one case, I believe there was a sort of a logic time bomb that was left, so it went off to destroy data after they had left the organization. So sabotage is going to be something that organizations have to think about when they're giving users access to data, to servers. Are they giving too much access? Do they have visibility and controls to see what's going on when a user has access to sensitive data, that if they were to sabotage it, what could a forensics investigation help them recover? So again, a very topic-rich area to be concerned with. Another thing that a user might do to sabotage their organization is infect it. Think about the damage from a malware or a ransomware infection to the organization. They could do that not just to hurt the organization or to eat up resources, but also to possibly even masquerade their own activities. You know, if the organization is too busy recovering from a ransomware infection, and if you think about the recovery involved in that, what's that going to do to your forensics investigation for something else? Now you've probably just forced the organization to destroy a lot of the evidence as well in their recovery efforts from the ransomware or malware infection. So a lot of things that a user could do to sabotage an organization as well, that if you don't have a technology that's able to see these actions as the user's doing them, committing these actions, committing these acts of deception, if you don't have something watching that and giving you the visibility you need into the organization, then think about how hard it's going to be for your forensics investigation after the fact, once you know the data has been destroyed or once the breach has occurred. So a lot of stuff to think about here. Again, this is a very feature-rich topic and one that I've been passionate about for years, and I was very excited to be able to talk about this today. Now, Nick, I want to talk a little bit about what an organization can do and how an organization like Veriato and our technology can help. And this is the key area that I want people to think about. I've tried to, at some high level, talk about a lot of the areas that organizations need to be thinking about when it comes to how do you do a forensics investigation? What if the user is actually trying to destroy data, hide their tracks, using deceptive actions, sabotaging a network? Well, what do you do if you don't have a technology in place? How hard is that investigation going to be versus a well-prepared organization that has an infrastructure with some security tools, with an insider threat protection program in place? Without those tools or without that preparation, then a forensics investigation is going to be much more difficult and very unlikely to succeed if you don't have adequate tools and adequate capabilities in place. So what can you do? I would recommend that you have visibility at all times into all activities when they happen in your network. And by that, I mean employing a technology like user activity monitoring or user behavior analytics tool like what Veriato offers. We give that visibility because now what happens is any actions that a user might take to hide their tracks, to destroy data, to sabotage the network. We see those activities as they're happening. Think of the crime scene. Think of the detective that shows up after the crime has occurred. They're trying to put the timeline in place. They're trying to uncover the rocks and see were there footprints here. Did the criminal cover their tracks? Did they destroy evidence? Well, if you had a security camera at the scene the whole time, you might see that the data was destroyed, but now that you can also see that it was destroyed, and that factors into your investigation. Now you have better visibility because you can see the action happening and possibly alert on it, if, depending on the technology you have, so that the damage might be minimal, or that maybe the crime can be evaded altogether. And if you have if your technology is sophisticated enough, you can play back the entire sequence of events, just like a security camera would. So visibility into actions when they're happening through alerts and through monitoring technology, and the ability to play back everything in its order, which will be critical if, for example, timestamp data was altered or any other sort of deceptive tactics were performed to alter the appearance of what the flow of events might have looked like. And above all, alert on suspicious activities, specific suspect application use, suspect website access, Tor browser activity, and so forth. Many of these topics we talked about today, if you just alert on this and say, hey, is this a sanctioned tool? Why would our user be using this in our environment? What else are they doing? Putting the pieces together are going to be critical to any organization trying to combat a breach, trying to combat an insider threat. And in the case of a insider that's trying to cover their tracks, what can the organization do to make sure that they can see those tracks before they were covered up? Additionally, you might want to consider blocking access to unwanted sites and network applications. These are aspects of Veriato Cerebral that we can help you with. You might want to inventory the tools that are sanctioned within your organization, because if you know what is allowed, then it's going to make it easier to block or to alert on other tools that are not. And just having a good inventory of your assets, what are sanctioned tools for disk encryption, or if you have a data deletion policy, is that for everyone, or is it just for your IT folks, or just a select few? Really having a granular appreciation for who has the tools that can be used as a weapon, and if they're sanctioned, making sure that only the authorized users in the organization have that access. Understanding what file, if in the age of cloud storage, what cloud storage sanction tools are you using? You might be using Box, but not Google Drive. So if the one is allowed access to the other, it might constitute something that's a suspicious action at the very least. So again, having that inventory of what the organization does allow and being able to alert on or investigate access to non-sanctioned tools is going to be critical to making sure that data isn't breached, or that your employees aren't trying to steal data or otherwise subvert the network. And this all ends into why I want to talk about Veriato. Employing a user employee monitoring or user behavior analytics technology is going to be probably the most critical component of this investigation, which is giving you the eyes and the visibility into what users are doing in the network. And if they're trying to cover their tracks, you get that data as well. So you don't have to wait until after the breach has occurred or after the action or activity has occurred. You get the full record, the full audit, if you will, of all these actions, so that if a forensics investigation is needed, you can see, oh yes, Patrick was subverting data, he was leaking data, and he was trying to cover his tracks, and we've got all that information now. And that's the strong takeaway that I want folks to think about, because without it, just try to imagine how hard that investigation is going to be. So just a quick, here's my sales pitch, and I thank you and appreciate your attention to this topic. Again, it's one that I've loved for years and love talking about, and could probably talk about for hours and hours in more detail, and certainly in some of the areas that have very rich angles and aspects to it. But the one thing I want people to understand is that Veriato offers a technology that can give you the visibility for a forensics investigation. And if a user did try to cover their tracks, we would be able to capture that as well. We do that through user activity monitoring, and we have a machine learning component in Cerebral that uses machine learning for user and entity behavior analytics that helps you with large organizations or in a variety of other areas look for changes over time in resource use. So it can probably help in that area to identify or alert on the fact that maybe tools that typically aren't being used are now being used in the environment. And if you need that full forensics investigation, our logging and user activity monitoring capabilities are going to give you everything that happened, whether the user was trying to cover their tracks or not. But think about if they're trying to cover their tracks, how important that data is, and that is going to be one of the huge strengths of a sophisticated user activity monitoring technology like Cerebral. So we're going to give you everything that occurred on the endpoint in the organization. You can see every application that was accessed, every URL that was accessed. We play it back in time, so you can see the sequence of events as they actually happened, not as the user tried to make it look like it happened if they were actually trying to alter timestamps, for example. And this gives you a very, very strong tool for forensics investigation. Again, whether the user is trying to cover their tracks or not. A little bit about Veriato. We've been providing this technology for nearly 20 years. We've won several awards, including Best Insider Threat Solution just this year from Cybersecurity Excellence Awards. And some of our customers sort of speak to the strength and the power of and the value of our technology. 6 out of 10 of the major largest technology companies. 7 out of 10 of the largest financial organizations, and 8 out of 10 of the largest healthcare providers in the country use our technology. So the question is, I want people to think about is what visibility do you have? And we would love to talk more about Cerebral with you. Nick, with that, I've done my pitch. I hope we've had a great discussion and love to hear your thoughts if you have any questions. And you probably have a lot of deep insights of your own. I'd love to pick your brain a little bit.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. One of the questions that came in here, and I actually love this. I'm assuming there's a little bit of cynicism here. It's from Desmond. Desmond says, how many employees are technically sophisticated enough to carry out these activities? And I think it's a valid question because the person that works in accounting probably just knows accounting, right? I mean, more than likely, right? But there are some people that are technically savvy. I'd love to get some of your input there. It's one of the reasons why I brought up the stat at the beginning about 60% of all external attacks leverage lateral movement, which means they're using internal credentials, which means that eventually you're trying to watch an insider. You think it's an insider doing the covering of their tracks. And those people are very sophisticated. Those are the people that know Windows better than probably the people that are on the call today, because they're making their living trying to figure out ways to either take advantage of vulnerabilities or to avoid being detected, that sort of thing. So what's your thoughts on the sort of the question of how many employees really are technically sophisticated enough to carry out these activities?
Sure. So I've got a couple of responses to that. Number one, and not to be cynical, but all it takes is one. I think on the ears, I want to hear 25% of my employees are malicious before I'm going to worry about this. Well, it really just takes one. We're in the age of massive data breaches, and you don't have to be a massive organization to accumulate massive amounts of data. And so it just speaks to organizations big and small have an enormous vulnerability when it comes to what happens if a breach occurs. And if you've got any data whatsoever, massive or otherwise, the damage of that data being leaked to the wrong place can be crippling, if not destructive, to your organization. There are liabilities now. Organizations are being held more and more accountable for breaches now. Why? Because law enforcement can't catch the bad guys. If the last 30 years of internet history are any lesson, the malware guys have been able to thwart law enforcement. They've been able to thwart antivirus, ironically using some of these very tools and techniques we talked about today. And so all it takes is one breach and you're in the headlines. But honestly, how many are sophisticated enough? Well, part of this discussion, I hit on some topics that let's just say you weren't that familiar with the topic. Maybe you've heard about the dark web, or maybe you've heard of the Tor browser. Maybe you've heard of a couple of these things. They tend to be interesting and attractive to someone who's considering a malicious act against an organization. So I think the stigma or it's taboo, but it's interesting. The headlines are growing as far as drawing attention to some of these activities and these tactics. And so I think that's what's drawing potential greater use of counterforensics techniques, is because it's attractive. And we hope that 99% of your employees would never consider doing this. But to the one or two that find it interesting and, hey, I want to try that, and what's going to happen, and that's the real danger, is people being curious but having a reason to want to breach the data. So I can think of and imagine a lot of scenarios where this is not a trivial thing. It's not a theoretical area. It's any criminal who's committed an act more than once probably knows what they messed up the first time, and they learn their lessons. Now they want to do it better by hiding their tracks. So now imagine you just hired that guy to run your sales team or your IT department. So this is what we're trying to educate people on, is that for your organization, you need that additional technology with the eyes and the ears, watching and listening to what's going on in your network. I'm saying listening figuratively, of course, but the visibility that you get is the headlines for breaches are nonstop, and they're only escalating. And so I think that part of that is attracting more people to want to do more of the same. And that's kind of the fear that I have, and why I want to educate on this more.
There's another interesting aspect of this, just real quick, and then there's a couple more questions, and we've got about 4 minutes left. But some of the counter forensics that could be going on might be, I'm going to sort of make up a scenario as I go along here. Let's say there's somebody in accounts payable, and they cut themselves a check. And then the counter forensics is going back and modifying something in the AP system to make it look like, some other checks all added up to the total of what they gave, so the ending balance is all kind of match up or something. It doesn't have to be something as, not that any of the things you said were wrong, but just it could be something as simple as they're going to go and misuse their privileges, one, to benefit themselves, but then two, to hide the tracks of what they did by going into the very system they have rights to do stuff with. So it may not be as sophisticated as what we're talking about. It should be just something as simple as deleting an entry in the AP system so it doesn't show that a check was written to me, or whatever. So a couple questions.
That's a great.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to comment on that. That's a great example. The type of risks that an organization can face from insiders are they are broad and will vary. It's a huge spectrum. We had one customer, and they're here in South Florida, and forgive me, the name escapes me, but we did have a use case with them by name, but it's just, unfortunately, the name escapes me. But they actually had employees stealing from them. They knew someone was stealing, but they didn't know who, they didn't know the details, and they bought our software, and they were able to actually recover to the tune of they were a small company, so for them to recover a couple $1 million was a huge deal to them. It's a huge return of investment to having an insider threat protection technology that was then able to see what was going on. And this was a shipping company, so they were altering labels and then sending shipments to someone else who was then going to sell it and then take the cash and run. So it doesn't sound that sophisticated, and it was very I don't want to say it was high tech. It wasn't terribly high tech in what they were doing, but without a technology to be able to record what was going on, see their activities, and actually give the evidence that law enforcement was then able to use, they would have been suffering serious losses, which for them was substantial.
Yeah, let's do a couple of really fast-paced questions. We got about 1.5 minutes left. I think that's about it. So these are actually about Cerebral. Neil's asking, what are the system resources if turned on for an organization of 175 employees? I guess he's kind of asking about, what's the footprint? Is it going to impact performance, that kind of thing?
So we take great pride in ensuring that it's a low-impact client. If you want to call us, we can get into more detail. But at the end of the day, I like to say it's less than antivirus. And you think about what antivirus is doing, it's intercepting every file, read and write on the hard drive to make sure it's not something that's malicious. So that's something that organizations are already used to. Our client is very similar. We try to make it very low impact, but also seeing all the data that would constitute evidence for an investigation. So if you want more details, please reach out to us.
All right, it looks like we're at the top of the hour. There are a couple of questions that didn't get answered. So for those of you that asked a question that we didn't get a chance to answer, because we want to respect everyone's time, make sure we get everyone out here at 12 o'clock like we said we would, someone from Veriato will reach directly out to you and make sure that your question gets answered. So don't feel like we're sliding you. We just don't have time to cover today on live. So with that, Patrick, hey, thank you for a great presentation, very informative, lots and lots of detail. I know there's some stuff these folks can really take back and utilize. So thanks for your input today.
Thank you, Nick, for hosting.
Yeah, always a pleasure. You guys in the audience, thanks for your questions, for some of your comments as well, and thanks for your attendance. And that concludes today's webcast, and we'll catch you on the next one.